Guten Morgen. Dankeschön for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. So, public understanding of science. Why does it matter? So this picture really represents that to me. This is a beach border between two counties in Florida in the United States with different stay-at-home policies in April 2020. And if you remember, April 2020 was just the heart of the crisis of COVID. So there is here a literal line in the sand between different perspectives on how to follow and enact scientific recommendations. So I would say we all need to make informed decisions about scientific issues, not just those studying in STEM, but citizens as well. And this is the basis of my book with Dr. Barbara Hofer, pictured here with me. And the book is called Science Denial, Why It Happens and What to Do About It, published by Oxford. So first we must get a couple of definitions, and we must talk about not just denial, but doubt and resistance. So when we talk about denial, that's one thing. And then we talk about doubt, which is something different. And then resistance, a third way to combat science. And one thing that's very important is that many people believe that there are science deniers and non-science deniers as if it's a personality characteristic. But that is not true. We are all susceptible to this. It is not an us and them phenomena. So, definitions. Denial. Fortunately, flat-out denial is very uncommon. It's rare. Denial is a belief-based stance and a wholesale rejection of science. So you will see someone random here that I chose to represent denial of science. Saying that global warming is a hoax. Then you see people who say that the earth is flat. There's actually a flat earth conference. And another random example, vaccines causing autism. Apparently now all sorts of other things related to vaccines cause autism. But much more common than that is what we call cafeteria denial. And this is when we pick and choose what to believe and what to deny. And we can all do this. Barbara and I read a study about chocolate, eating chocolate when you're postmenopausal makes you lose weight. And we were like, great study. But then we looked at it, and it had very few participants, no control group. So we all like to pick and choose, but we must be more critical than that. And then resistance. Resistance is particularly common, and this is when findings of science do not fit with our personal beliefs, they conflict with our social identity, or they require deeper thinking and analysis than we may be willing to do. Now, another thing that's extremely important to remember is that doubt and resistance are fomented. So this is the case that in the United States in particular, although what happens in the US unfortunately doesn't stay in the US. Sometimes we export our worst things like McDonald's and, and manufactured scientific doubt. This is an excellent book by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, who are philosophers of science. And this playbook started with the picture above for the young folks in the room. This was a meeting in front of Congress with a bunch of tobacco executives raising their hand and swearing that tobacco did not have any ill medical effects when they knew darn well it did. And this playbook that they established in how to manufacture doubt, create doubt in the public's mind, has been adopted and played over and over and over again. First with climate change, and well, first after tobacco was climate change, and now, COVID, vaccines, over and over again. So another important thing to remember is that people often ask me, but skepticism, isn't skepticism good? Yes, skepticism is a healthy and natural part of science until it goes awry and you're skeptical of everything, then it's not good. Back to one of my favorite authors, Oresky's, a recent book, Why Trust Science? Well, why should we trust science? Well, the argument from Oresky's is science relies on empirical evidence carefully collected and analyzed. It builds on prior findings, accumulates evidence over time. But most important, it is a collective enterprise that relies on peer review and expert vetting of ideas, theories, and results. However, we are quite aware that science is not infallible, yet it is self-correcting, which is the strength of science and something that we do not teach well in the United States. And so during COVID, you had a lot of people, when recommendations for mask wearing shifted based on new evidence, people thought that was corrupt or lying because they don't understand the natural evolving and correcting nature of science. What Barbara and I argue in the book is the real thing we want people to adopt is a scientific attitude. This is based on the work of Lee McIntyre, also a philosopher of science. And a scientific attitude is an openness to seek new evidence and a willingness to change one's mind in light of new evidence. So it's both of those things. Those are critically important. If you don't want to read the book, here's a crib note, a version of the book, which is a paper Barbara and I wrote years ago, which goes over some of the same challenges of public understanding of science, like overcoming misconceptions, understanding uncertainty, trust, and evaluating knowledge claims, leveraging emotions and conflicting beliefs, supporting attitudes. These are the topics in the book, but for a brief article on it, you can look at this one. All right, so those are the topics we're going to touch on as briefly as I can today, so we have plenty of time for questions. So we have conceptual challenges. We live in a digital environment of mis and disinformation, particularly in the United States. How do we shift beliefs on these hot topics? How do we know who to trust, whose knowledge to trust? And what about identity, emotions, and motivations? Well, let's start with conceptual challenges. This is Senator Inhofe from the great state of Oklahoma holding a snowball in his hand on the Senate floor years ago when there was a big snowstorm in Washington, D.C. that shut everything down. They called it Snowmageddon. And this is somebody who is relying on a thinking and reasoning bias, which is an over-reliance on system one, quick intuitive processing, confirmation bias, seeking and interpreting information that aligns with pre-existing beliefs, or like Senator Inhofe here, availability heuristic, believing information that's available to us, and that creates this false balance and makes misinformation more available. So we did a recent study on how to present terms quickly to people so that we know what kind of terms matter in this quick processing and this heuristic processing. And we looked at the terms people use to describe climate change. And I'm not sharing the data on this because I don't have time, but I will tell you the result. And we looked at these terms: climate change, climate emergency, climate crisis, and climate justice. And it turns out that the best terms were actually climate change and global warming, which is also something we looked at, but climate justice, not so much. And we think that's because the term was unfamiliar to people. So if you're going to make a quick heuristic judgment, you want to use terms that people resonate with. How about our digital media environment? Well, science denial is hardly new. It's been going on since Galileo, right? But Galileo didn't have a social media account. So now what is happening is that science denial is amplified through social media. And there's so much mis and disinformation. If you haven't seen the film Don't Look Up, that's basically what it's about. So how do we make sense of science claims in a digital world? How do we decide whose knowledge is valid and whose knowledge to accept? This is an epistemic cognition issue. It turns out that you're more likely to believe science articles posted by your friends on Facebook than those of experts. There's been a decline in trust and expertise, particularly in the United States, over the past 40 years. And everyone lives now in their social media bubbles, and this erosion of trust in expertise is leading people to turn to non-expert sources. So what do we do about that? We have an article here for teachers that we wrote that there's a need to improve students' ability to source information online. And these are the 6 steps, and I'm not going to go over these now, but this article is available. I can send you any of these articles you're interested in. And right now we have an NSF grant, one of the few that did not get canceled. Yay! And we're teaching teachers to teach students sourcing. You probably all are aware that Finland has an excellent program on this from very early age, and it's been very effective. And I can talk more about our program or theirs. All right, shifting beliefs on hot topics. So going back to my research on conceptual change, this is a model that we developed many, many years back called the Cognitive Reconstruction of Knowledge model. What we emphasized in this model is that to change people's conceptual understandings of hot topics, topics that are emotionally evocative or that people have a deep connection to with their identity, then you really have to go a couple more steps. People are able to change their views on things that they don't have a vested interest in or don't have a really strong commitment to. But when they do, we have to invoke what we call warm change. We have to look at their values and their goals, their beliefs, their self-efficacy, their interests, their emotions, their epistemic motives. And we have done that in our research to change people's ideas about the mechanism behind climate change, the safety of GMOs, and scientific uncertainty. So in this article, what we try to describe is the relationship between conceptions, scientific conceptions, and attitudes, because really attitudes are key. So for a conception, you can have an accurate conception or an inaccurate conception. So you can also have positive or negative attitudes. So if you have an accurate idea about humans' role in climate change, you may be pro-action to reduce the use of fossil fuels. If you have an inaccurate idea about climate change, you may think it's just pollution in general, which actually is a common misconception. And you might still be pro-actions, but your actions might be to reduce pollution in general, which isn't going to be sufficient. You need to reduce CO2 and methane. Then you might have an accurate conception about what's causing climate change, but have a negative attitude. For example, you may think it's too costly to correct the problem. Or you may be in what we call the sweet spot, which is you have an inaccurate idea and a negative attitude. And we like to call this low-hanging fruit. This is where my students are like, yes, we can do something here. Because we find if you can correct the misconception, you can also reduce the negative attitudes. So what are some of the ways that people use to confront misconceptions? Well, a famous one that you've probably heard about, Sander van der Linden is one of the lead authors on this work, is called pre-bunking. So this is where you stop misinformation before it starts by exposing people to a low dose of the misinformation. It's definitely a vaccine metaphor that he employs here. So you tell people, you may be hearing in the next few weeks, for example, that masks cause language delays in young children, but this is not correct, okay? So this is when someone is about to hear this information, you can preemptively forewarn them. They then include a refutation, and in this pre-bunking technique, one of the things that they do is they explain to people a misinformation technique. So one misinformation technique is cherry picking, where you pick certain evidence out to support your preconceived notion. So you not only pre-bunk and then explain, you also tell them about these techniques, warn them about the techniques. This article here, Ecker et al. In Nature 2020 is an excellent overview of these techniques. So what if someone's already been exposed to the misinformation and you know that they have? Well, then you can go to debunking. Hopefully this QR code works for a free access to the debunking handbook. The debunking handbook overviews many of these misinformation confronting techniques. If you have any trouble getting that, just let me know and I'll send you the link. So what they say is misinformation is sticky. So once you get misinformation in your head, it's hard to get it out. So certainly the pre-bunking technique try to prevent misinformation from getting in the first place. However, if in fact it is there, you can debunk it. But a critical step is to explain why the misinformation is false. So nobody ever changes their mind after you tell them they're wrong. So that doesn't work. You have to tell them why that information is not correct. They recommend something called the fact sandwich. So you lead with a fact, you warn about where this myth comes from, you explain why it's incorrect, and then you end with the fact. Don't worry if you didn't download the debunking handbook, I can get it to you. In my own research, we've used a particular type of text that does debunking, and it's called a refutation text. It has a three-part structure. You state the misconception, you refute the misconception, and again, you explain the scientifically valid position, and this is really important. So you might say, some people believe these recent changes in average global temperature are due to natural causes alone. That's a common misconception. However, scientists believe this is incorrect. So one of the things we don't do is say, you are incorrect, right? Because people don't like to be told they're incorrect. So then you go on to explain the correct position. We have shown that refutation texts can shift people's knowledge towards scientific points of view and also their attitudes. As I showed you the relationship between the two, it's very, very important because the knowledge is one thing, but it's the attitudes people tend to act on. So you want to shift both. We had an NSF-funded refutation text meta-analysis that we conducted with our colleagues and found that this technique was effective. We've looked at this topic with the greenhouse effect, climate change, with Krista, who maybe we'll talk about that study. Also, we've done many on climate change. We've looked at GMOs, misconceptions about GMOs. For example, people think they're clones. One of the things we did in this study is show that the backfire effect is not something to worry about. It's very minimal. The backfire effect is when people tend to double down on their original conceptions. And I had to include this one by Danny Fleming because Danny was at Tübingen a few years ago as a postdoc. So as I said, we'd recently published this ref text meta-analysis where we did show the effectiveness of this. This is published in Educational Psychologist, and I'd be happy to send you the study. All right, moving on to epistemic cognition and trust. I think I'm going fast enough here. So, as you know, epistemic cognition is how individuals think and reason about knowledge and knowing. So, what is knowledge and how do we know what we know? What are the sources of knowledge that we trust and why do we trust them? So, obviously, this influences scientific understanding. Barbara and I have written quite a bit about this. This is really where our collaboration began long before the book. It's really critical when individuals have to decide what counts as evidence or resolve competing knowledge claims or evaluate information critically. It's especially important when you have to integrate across multiple and even conflicting sources of information and when you're trying to incorporate new knowledge. Don't worry about this massive diagram. I just wanted to show you that one of the things we do with epistemic cognition is we revamped our dated model of conceptual change and we updated it to be about epistemic conceptual change. In other words, not how you change your mind about a particular scientific topic, but how you change your mind about the nature of knowledge itself. And this was published by my colleagues and I. Doug Lombardi is the lead author, so of course you can get this and look more at the article. But the key in this is we added something very important, and that's plausibility judgments. So what we want is for people to evaluate evidence and decide what evidence is more plausible, which hopefully is the scientific evidence. So for example, we use an instructional scaffold to do this. Doug Lombardi's done a tremendous amount of work in this area. He has a lab. If you want instructional scaffolds to use with your classes or with your students, please let me know and I'll give you the link to his lab. So in this activity, we have two pieces of evidence, Model A and Model B. Model A would be the scientific model, so let's say human-induced climate change. And Model B would be a skeptic model, for example, increased solar radiation, which a lot of people think is the cause of climate change. And then you present students with 4 pieces of scientific evidence, and these are credible pieces of evidence. And you ask the students to evaluate both models against the evidence. Does it support, strongly support, contradict, or have nothing to do with Model A and Model B? So you'll be drawing 8 different lines. And what we find is that students in middle school and up are able to evaluate scientific evidence very critically with this, and they can judge that the models are more scientific. So in other words, we ask them which model is more correct, and they usually vote for Model A, the more scientific model. And then we also ask them to make a plausibility judgment. Which model is more plausible, as in more likely to be true, and people do vote for Model A. So we've used this with middle school, high school, and college students. We'd like to use it with legislators in the United States Congress, but we're not sure it would work there because they're not really open to shifting their mind back to scientific attitude. We've done it with many, many topics. We've done it with fracking. We've done it with GMOs. We've done it with climate change, many different topics. Okay, so I seem to be flying through. This is really good. Epistemic trust. So, as I said, epistemic trust is what sources of knowledge do you trust? And as I mentioned, there's been a decline in trust of authorities and experts in the United States dating back decades. This really started in about 40, 50 years ago. So there is a long-term effort in the United States to systematically promote mistrust of expertise. So this is not happening overnight. I think many people might suspect that the United States has gone crazy overnight. It has gone crazy over decades. So has gone crazy, but not overnight. There's a huge social identity influence. So in other words, whether you believe Dr. Fauci, our main lead doctor under 2 administrations during COVID, is a hero or a villain, does not depend on the science or his recommendations. It depends on what your friends think. It depends on what your Facebook friends think. It depends on what your church group members think, not based on anything to do with the science, unfortunately. So I want to acknowledge that there is reasons for distrust of science, particularly among communities of color. Historically and marginalized communities in the United States have been mistreated by science and scientists over decades, and that is something that has led to mistrust. And during the vaccinations of COVID, those communities were hard to reach because they had earned mistrust. In other words, they knew experiences that led them to be mistrustful, and that was a real big challenge in getting those groups vaccinated. Okay, so what we find, based on this mistrust, is a huge gap in the United States between the public's views and scientific views. So, for example, you see this giant gap on the safety of GMOs, on climate change being related to human activity, and about vaccine benefits outweighing the risks. So I've recently written about this. This article's in Press, again, based on Lee McIntyre's work on the scientific attitude. That's his book there, about what has caused this erosion in trust and what is contributing to it. And it is contributing to science denial because, of course, people recognize that scientists are experts. So what can be done? So in this article, I outlined some steps that people can take to increase trust. So one thing that we're suggesting is more direct communication. Over decades, as science has gotten more and more complex, you're not hearing directly much from scientists, right? Even many experts in this room, how many of you think you really understand how an mRNA vaccine works? Yeah, it's a little tricky, right? And you're all extremely highly educated, extremely well informed, and you're not sure either, neither am I. My nephew's an infectious disease doctor. I had him explain it to me. I still don't get it. So what we need is we need more direct communication with scientists, and they need to be able to explain their science directly to the public. And we would love for scientists to write more for the public and know their audience. I've spoken to scientific audiences before about this, and I say, what are the misconceptions in your field? And they don't know. Well, you can't confront misconceptions if you don't even know what they are. One thing that's very helpful is leveraging trusted community members. So if you remember, I said that our communities of color were hesitant to get vaccinated. So some pastors in historically black churches had vaccination clinics after Sunday services, and they encouraged everybody to just go out the door, and the vaccines are over here. And of course, that created much more uptake of vaccines because that was coming from a trusted community member. So as you communicate with communities that are about your science, if you're not able to make that connection, one thing you can do is get some trusted members. And of course, we're fostering a scientific attitude. All right, I think I'm on track time-wise to finish up with identity, motivations, and emotions. So, social identity. As I mentioned, group membership now is the biggest predictor of views of science. It's not even education, unfortunately. Individuals conform to the attitudes of their group. So what can you do about this? You can be persuasive by using in-group members. Again, use people they trust, that's part of their in-group. And I think we'll have a lecture by Krista tomorrow about sense of self. Sense of self is also tied to social identity. So what did we do to address this in a research study about conservation? Is we used in-group messaging to persuade people to conserve water in a high consumption environment in where I used to live in near Pasadena, California. A lot of people who own a home get messages in the United States about how much water they're using and how much water their neighbors are using, and this tends to backfire because if their neighbors are using more water, they're like, dang, I'm gonna take a longer shower today. So it does not work. So what we did instead is we employed social identity framing. If you're any social psychologists in this audience, you'll know what that is. It's using we language. And we said, we Southern Californians, we conserve water. And we measured water consumption. We literally measured water consumption. We later found out that was probably illegal. I had a very testy meeting with the head of Pasadena Water and Power, which I'll never forget. Anyway, the point is this. For high water consumers, this knowledge deficit approach backfired, but the we language was helpful. So the whole point of this is leverage identity. Leverage it. Use it. Motivated reasoning. Motivations can bias our understanding, deciding what evidence to accept based on what conclusion one prefers. Individuals are much more critical of the methods of a study when they don't like the outcome. So one of the things you can do on this is measure and address motivations. Have a found out today, I have a manuscript, a presentation accepted on a new measure we created to measure motivated reasoning and scientific acceptance, and I'm excited to tell you about that. And what are some of the motivations that influence reasoning? Social identity. So if you're a conservative and conservatives in your group reject climate change, you might reject climate change. If you have a vested interest, countries with high GDP have lower climate change acceptance rates. If you have a cognitive bias, like we saw with Snowmageddon, or if you have an epistemic motive, for example, uncomfortable with ambiguity. Climate models are not perfect, that's why they're called models. And some people want them to be perfect, and they're uncomfortable with them because they're not perfect. How do we address these issues? Well, my former grad student, now professor, Imogen Herrick, has been doing something called community science data talks. These are wonderful. What she does is she goes into a neighborhood and has the teacher help the students download real-time data. For example, in Southern California, she did this with tree canopy cover, heat island index, and then what she does is she overlays redlining data. For those of you not from the US, redlining data is the historical evidence of how communities of color were denied opportunities to live in certain areas. And that's why neighborhoods in the United States are very segregated to this day. So when she overlays the redlining data onto this data, the students notice, hey, why does Manhattan Beach have a lot of parks and trees and we don't? So what she teaches them is to look for these patterns and to ask questions like, how does this data make you feel? And to quote a famous feminist in the United States, the truth will set you free, but first it will really piss you off. I'm going to skip this study. This is a place-based study we did. Again, part of how to address these issues is to be in place, like that study I just told you about. This is a wonderful study where we created virtual interactive exhibits to help people understand the Ice Age environment in Los Angeles. And participants get to see an entrapment scene with mammoths running around and help them to understand how the climate has changed in Los Angeles. And this was permanently installed, and we were able to compare them to just a typical museum exhibit of a poster that contained the same information. All right, so I have to wrap up because I've only got a few minutes left. So in our book and in our work, what we try to do is promote a little bit of action, not just, this is Elvis Presley in case anyone doesn't recognize. We try to promote, he had a song, a little less conversation, a little more action. So that's why Elvis is on the screen. So what we do in the book is we talk about recommendations for individuals, educators, policymakers, and science communicators. So what can individuals do? Cultivate a scientific attitude in themselves, nurture it in others, in your students, in your relatives, in your crazy uncle that comes to holiday dinners. Improve search skills and evaluation of scientific claims and sources. I mentioned to you that we have an NSF grant on improving sourcing, but we combined that improvement of sourcing with the model evidence link diagrams. So we want students to both evaluate the source and evaluate the evidence. Be aware of your own cognitive biases and motivations in your reasoning. Remember, Barbara and I really wanted that study to be true about chocolate. Listen to others with curiosity, compassion, and openness. So an example here is my niece, about 30 years old. She didn't want to get vaccinated because she'd heard from a Facebook friend that vaccines cause infertility and she wanted to have children. So what I didn't do is say, well, that's silly, because that's not a good approach. So what I did was I said, gee, I haven't heard that. Maybe you should check with your doctor, because I knew she trusted her doctor. And she did, and the doctors refuted that. she got vaccinated, and happy ending to the story, she convinced her Facebook friend to get vaccinated as well. This is for the United States. Vote. They don't vote. People in the United States who care about climate change don't list it as one of the top 20 things they vote on. So crazy. All right, what can educators do? Enhance their own scientific understanding. Teachers in the United States don't understand science in elementary education any better than the general public. Teach about the nature of science. In other words, science is evolving and changing. It's not a bunch of facts in your science textbook. Foster scientific thinking in all students, not just those who are going on in STEM careers. Teach about real-world applications of science, those community science data talks. When students download the data, they see this data influencing their lives, and they are excited about it, and they want to do something. They write to their mayor and ask for more trees to be planted in their neighborhood. Let students choose their own area of inquiry, what they're excited about, and be aware of their beliefs, attitudes, and identity, and recognize students' emotions. Hopefully we'll hear a lot more about that from Krista tomorrow. Fostering digital literacy, as I mentioned, Finland is doing this incredibly at early age levels. And I'm on my last slide, so she's holding up. I'm done. So what can science communicators do? We have a lot of them here. Write about science for the general public. Write about how scientists know what they know, and know your audience's misconceptions, motivations, emotions, and identities. And also, don't just tell them what we know, tell them how we know it. And don't do the both sides things that journalists like to do. Both sides is for opinions, not for science. And then I have recommendations for policymakers, really, really quick, which is in the United States, we'd love for them to actually listen to science advisors. And that's it.